Hi everyone. So I'm going to continue with finishing up Stave 1 of A Christmas Carol and then move into Stave 2. I will pause and probably ask you some questions. The purpose of reading is to continue to identify textual evidence that describes characters. That textual evidence can be either direct characterization, where the author directly tells us something about the character, or it can be indirect, which again, we can use the mnemonic STEAL to help us gather information about a character's personality, his appearance, etc. Remember, STEAL represents speech, so what a character says, what a character is thinking, the impact or effect of a character on another character, their actions, and their looks. So we're going to start on page 24. That's where we left off. And probably it's the second paragraph down that begins with "at this time." "At this time of the rolling year," the specter said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to the blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre go on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. And again, we did have that as indirect characterization, because the quaking exceedingly represents how terrified he is. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." "How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. So again, this is a perfect example of indirect characterization where Scrooge is perspiring and wiping his brow, which usually represents somebody, yes, I know, hot, but also somebody who is feeling very confused, scared, terrified. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visit," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what was passed between us." So this is a little bit different than anything that you've probably heard, or the play that was read, or any movie. This technically takes place over 3 nights. So Marley's ghost just informs him that, yes, he's going to be haunted by 3 ghosts. The first one will be at 1 in the morning. The second one will be the next night at the same hour, so at 1 in the morning. And the third upon the next night with the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. So it's not really important. It is just a major difference between the novel and some of the plays and movies. When he had said these words, the spectre took his wrapper from the table and bounded around his head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound his teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with his chain wound over and about his arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step he took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. He beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up his hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None was free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom he saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hand, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep on the instant. Before we begin Stave 2, I just want to bring you back to page 26, where it talks about that the specter goes to the window, and the narrator says they were the moans and groaning of all the wispy spirits floated out upon the bleak, dark night. So if the setting was a moonlit, starry sky, we might have a hard time visualizing ghosts who are dreadfully sorrowful and can't help the people that they now want to help, zooming around in the atmosphere. So it's, again, very important that Charles Dickens set a dreary, haunting, solemn, dark, cold evening, because other than that, if we used any other setting, it just wouldn't be believable that these ghosts would be flying around and being so sorrowful because of what their penance is. And their penance, or their consequence for being stingy and reprehensible in life and not putting other humans in front of them, is seeing people that they want to help and not being able to do it. So, Stave 2. This is one of my favorite chapters. We are actually going to do a visualization assessment with this ghost or spirit. The first of the 3 spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that, looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for an hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gone into the works. 12. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct the most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. "Why, it is impossible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It is impossible, excuse me, that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief because, quote, 3 days after sight of this first of exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. So basically, Scrooge went to bed. It was after midnight. It was after 2 in the morning when he went to bed. Now he's listened to it go from 7 to 8, to 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, and 11 to 12. So he knows at 12 it's either midnight or noon. Now, it can't be midnight because he fell asleep after, he thought, since 2 o'clock in the morning comes after midnight. And he also can't be noon because it's pitch black outside and still cold and foggy. So he's very confused. Scrooge went to bed again and thought it over and over and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was. And the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released, to its first position and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered, on a sudden, that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and, considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. "Ding dong! 1/4 past," said Scrooge, counting. "Ding dong! 1/2 past," said Scrooge. "Ding dong! 1/4 to it," said Scrooge. "Ding dong! The hour itself," said Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. I want you just to note there, you can underline it. It's on page 31 where it says deep, dull, hollow, melancholy. This is the tone of the bell. So this really adds to the mood. We talked about how mood is how we feel while we're reading this. So the fact that the clock striking the hour and it being very deep, very hollow sounding, almost echoey, very dull, very melancholy. There's that word again. So Charles Dickens is using vocabulary, sentence structure, a lot of description, and his type of vocabulary, again, using that melancholy word, to clearly identify a mood or create a mood of gloominess, depression, sadness, etc. Lights flicked up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. As close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. And we're actually going to stop there. So I want you to think just for a moment, how does this setting continue to move the plot forward? So, for example, if we had a bright, sunny, 90-degree day, it wouldn't be evening if it was sun, would we have this sense of doom and gloom and haunting as we read? If it was a starry, calm, windless night where the moon was shining bright, again, would that type of setting make us feel melancholy, scared, confused, bewildered? Probably not. So it's really important that Charles Dickens took the time to develop this setting. Back in the 1800s, when Charles Dickens and a lot of other authors who are considered classical authors wrote, they made sure that their descriptions of setting were extremely detailed.